Okay, welcome to chapter 2. Now, chapter 1 was very easy to conceptualize as it just basically talked about what indigenous society was like before there was any European contact, the origins of European contact, primarily focusing on the Spanish and what their goals were. Chapters 2 and 3 are the really hard chapters in that they look at the establishment. Chapter 2 really looks at the establishment of these British North American colonies, sort of what the goals were of the individuals and groups that formed them, um, a little bit about their development, right? And then the next chapter, chapter 3, goes into really how those colonies developed and what life was like in each of those colonies. Then chapter 4 is about the Imperial War, establishing British hegemony in North America. That's the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. And then how relations between Great Britain and the colonies start to disintegrate immediately in the aftermath of the French and Indian War. In chapter 5 is the American Revolution. So 1 easy, 4 and 5 easy, 2 and 3, this is the heavy lifting. This is the really hard part because there's so much different stuff. So for me to talk about all of this, my goodness, you'd be listening to me for hours. Don't worry, this is going to be short. But just trying to set the stage that like 2 and 3 is where you really have to concentrate your efforts and slow down, because you're not just learning about this one thing called British North America. You have all of these different examples of colonies that have very distinct goals for foundation, okay? And what's kind of cool is that first part that you read talked about this idea of middle ground versus dominance, right? And the textbook tells you, hey, when the British first came over, every place was a middle ground, okay? The British immediately did not have dominance everywhere. It was different groups, whether it was British colonists and Dutch colonists, British colonists and French colonists, British colonists and Spanish colonists, in close proximity together, both cooperating and in conflict. And of course, British colonists in contact with, cooperating and being in conflict with different groups of Indians, okay? Now, in some cases, you will see there is sort of an early dominance that is displayed by British colonists. In other cases, you'll see this middle ground lingers for quite a long time as there are different groups that are living together. That's sort of the big picture here, okay? So you start out by learning about the early Chesapeake, right? And, we had said that prior to 1607, the British are really late in the game. And when they first start settling North America, they are very, very weak. They don't establish supremacy in North America until the 7 Years' War in 1763 when it concludes, okay? And so they talk about the Chesapeake and how after, the failure at Newfoundland, the failure at Roanoke, the Virginia Company is given a charter, right? And the initial colonists that go over to Jamestown are looking for immediate riches, not to work. And the colony barely holds on. You'll see the very draconian measures taken to force people to work and let the colony survive. They do discover tobacco. They find a way that they can make money. It's just going to be very difficult to make money. There's a desperate effort by the Virginia Company to bring in more settlers and encourage people, and they reward land for the number of people you bring in. The headright system. It's very sad. In 1619, the first African slaves are brought over. Slavery, though race-based slavery, is going to take some time to crystallize in Virginia. You'll see as you read this, race-based permanent slavery, which again is a unique American feature. I don't know what you learned in middle school about slavery in the ancient world, but as it emerges in America, first in the Caribbean and then in British North America, it is for life and it is exclusively by race. Originally, there were all kinds of unfree labor. So anyways, that you see the beginnings of slavery in Virginia. You see multiple Indian wars as if you're going to grow tobacco, you need more land, and tobacco exhausts the soil. So there's constant conflict with Indians. The original Virginia company cannot make money and goes broke very quickly, and Virginia becomes a royal colony. They also talk about all of the various cultural, yes, there's a lot of conflict with the Indians. The two major wars, you've got forget the first one, but they're going to talk a lot about the Powhatan Indian War, and then you have they talk about the various Powhatan wars. That's right. Sorry, I'm not going to stop and redo this again. Sorry, this is all kind of improv. So they're going to talk about the various wars with the local Indians, as the Indians are much stronger in the Chesapeake than they're going to be in New England. So they talk about conflict and exchanges. They talk about Maryland and Maryland as a proprietary colony to make money. Yeah, I mean, there's religious toleration for the day. And you'll read about the Maryland Act of Toleration, but there's also tremendous religious conflict. They talk more about Virginia expanding westward, coming into not only conflict with the Indians, but Bacon's Rebellion in 1676 is one of the biggest deals ever. Your textbook gives it a lot of ink. I wish they gave it even more, but it shows that conflict between groups of colonists where the coastal tidewater planter elite do not share the interests of the people in the backcountry, who are mostly former indentured servants. And as a result of this rebellion, the Eastern elites really turned to slavery after this to create a permanent subclass of unfreed labor when they see the conflict that can emerge when temporary unfree labor, i.e. indentures, try to start to assert their political rights. So that's a big deal. The textbook then goes on to talk about New England, right? And it talks about, you have a lot of religious dissent in England. Puritans that are Calvinist. You have Puritans that want to, again, this is ninth grade history, guys, but Puritans that want to purge the Church of England of any of its Catholic vestiges versus, and then there's this Puritan separatists, are Pilgrims, right, that want to leave all together. And so they go into some detail. Those first Puritan Pilgrim separatists are the luckiest people alive. You're like, well, wait a second, they were supposed to land in New York and they end up in Cape Cod. Yeah, well, they landed where all the Indians had died of disease a year prior. So there's abandoned Indian villages, and everything's already set for them. So it talks about that. It then goes on to talk about Puritans, other Puritan groups that formed the Massachusetts Bay Company to build their city upon a hill. They believe they're millennialists, that there's going to be a second coming and God's judgment is going to come down on England. And they believe because England is unholy, i.e. it's too Catholic, they want to leave and set up shop in the New World and be a model. However, they're not at all tolerant of religious dissent. It's a very different definition of religious freedom. The Puritans that come to Massachusetts want to be free to practice their religion, free of interference from the Church of England and the government of England, but there is zero tolerance of dissent. They talk about some famous dissenters in some colonies that were a result of their dissent. It also talks about, again, as we talk about middle ground, original interaction, cultural exchanges between Indians, and then the Pequod War, and then finally King Philip's War, which is like the last attempt of Indians to unite and try to drive out English colonists in New England. So you see that. They talk about the next thing you learn about are the Restoration colonies. Remember, this is after the Cromwellian Protectorate ends. Remember, the Puritans won the Roundheads, beat the Cavaliers in the English Civil War, and Oliver Cromwell became Lord Protectorate. And after the Puritans and Cromwell dies and his son was ineffective, and you see the Stuart dynasty restored. All of a sudden now, Charles the First, right? It goes James the First, Charles the First, James the First, Charles the First is killed, Charles the Second. Okay, sorry, I got my order wrong. So when Charles the Second comes back, because your two Restoration monarchs are Charles the Second and James the Second. Sorry, I haven't taught AP European history for 7 years now. You see the court start to award a lot of colonies where it's like, all right, well, one company's not going to make a quick buck, like that's not going to happen. But court favorites are given massive tracts of land, and wherever there's land, there's money to be made from that land. And so all of these colonies start different, whether it is the Carolinas, let me hit return, New York and New Jersey, and of course our own Pennsylvania. Very, without going into detail about each of these, because that's why you're reading the book, you'll see that they're founded with different objectives and they're run in very different ways. They have very different systems of government. Pay particular attention to Pennsylvania there. The textbook then goes into the last two things, where it talks a great deal about the Caribbean and how horrible slavery was there. It literally was buy a slave, import a slave, work a slave to death. It was hard to live even 10 years and then bring another, because there was so much money to be made in plantation agriculture, particularly sugar. The textbook also goes through about, how the colonies in North America are so linked to the Caribbean colonies in trade. It talks about how difficult it was to maintain slavery, as there are 7 slave revolts in the Caribbean in a very short period of time. There's 4 in North America, over the extent of British North America, and even the United States, once it's the United States. So it talks a great deal about the development of a slave-based plantation system in the Caribbean, how the English are the last to get in, but sort of are able to start to establish themselves in the Caribbean, because again, that link with the colonies. And it talks about the southwestern borderlands, and that's okay. But you see, again, those middle grounds, the proximity of the Spanish to English North America, and it goes into great detail about how Georgia was established. It's the last colony, why it was established. It's very unique, and kind of Georgia really fits nicely into this idea of, all of these colonies are kind of failed utopias, as they all had a very clear objective of a very almost what's the right word? Idealistic, not pragmatic, a very idealistic objective that none of them were able to meet. And you certainly see Georgia being one of those. And then, as they talk about the shifting balance of how in certain areas, Indians become increasingly marginalized at best, exterminated at worst. And then the last thing is, as it talks about, the Restoration, and James II, who's the last of the Restoration monarch, really tries to reel in the colonies. Particularly, you'll read about the Dominion of New England. There is some pushback to the colonies losing some of their local government prerogatives. We're nowhere near the idea of uniting and rebelling yet, but you start to see that there is some opposition between the interests of the crown and the interests of colonists. But the chapter ends with this idea of, all right, after William and Mary come in, and there's the Glorious Revolution and the increasingly Catholic autocratic James II is out, the crown start the new monarchs, William and Mary, and increasingly now Parliament, starts to believe in mercantilism, the idea that wealth is fixed. What a country needs is to have a favorable balance of trade. It's the idea that colonies exist for the benefit of the mother country, and the idea that a country's economy is not individual actors like the Virginia Company, but is rather the nation as a whole. So you see 3 navigation acts passed, which for all intents and purposes monopolize trade between the colonies and England. Things have to be shipped on English ships, and they have to be shipped to England, and there are taxes that are to be paid, and there are customs houses enacted and customs officials to collect those. And so that's where it kind of ends up. So again, chapter 1 easy, chapter 4 and 5 easy, 2 and 3 really, really, really hard, right? Why? Because there's so much stuff, okay? So just buckle up for chapter 2, as it's going to talk about how all of these different English colonies are founded. Again, think of them as failed utopias. They've got kind of idealistic visions that to some extent prove to be impractical. You're also looking at this idea of the shift from middle grounds, and again, it varies from place to place, where it's all these different groups being together, to where we start to see a singular English society created. And as we move into chapter 3 next, it talks specifically about each of those colonies. So good luck with chapter 2. Let me shut